Hello everyone, welcome back to the course on Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. This is lecture number 53 on Synthesis of Yoga Darshan in the West. W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot. In this lecture, I will talk about how the philosophy of yoga, how practices of yoga have been adopted and practiced in the West, and how the Western poets, Western writers have adopted yoga in their literary works. When we look at the origin of yoga, it belongs to the Indian traditions. It originated with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in the ancient times, and yoga is seen as Indian spiritual philosophical tradition. It has 1,000 years of history, and its references can be found in Vedas and Upanishads. And Patanjali has talked about and systematized it in his Yoga Sutras. And the purpose of yoga is the spiritual liberation, moksha from this world. And little later, when this book came into existence, and or when this idea came into existence, yoga became popular not just in India but also in the West, and most of the Western thinkers, writers, philosophers borrowed the idea of yoga. They studied yoga in Sanskrit literature and practiced in their own life, as well as followed the principles of yoga in their literary works. And it has also influenced by multiple Indian philosophical schools and multiple philosophical thoughts. So yoga, though it is originated by Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but there were a number of other traditions that also influenced its new forms and new dimensions. When we look at the meaning of yoga, what does yoga mean? It originates with the word use, which implies yoking, joining together, to bind, to integrate, to unite, or to unify. So yoga means to bring harmony, to unify, to integrate. It also has a broader meaning: to meditate, to recollect, to be adapted, and joined to, bound by duty, by karma, and to be appropriate. So the meaning of yoga is, in a very simple sense, harmony between body and mind. Harmony between body, mind, and the universe. And it is a means to make a person to be within one's self, to be in one's own mind, and it helps to control one's thoughts, one's desires, and also makes a person to concentrate on certain things, whatever they want. So the idea of yoga also connotes unity with the divine or the higher self. So yoga is also used in the Indian context as a medium to make the connection of soul with the God, with the higher self. It is also about self-regulation, about self-discipline, about integration of body, mind, and senses, but it is also a means of achieving the higher goals, where the soul can meet the God, or where the self can uplift itself. It is also about seeking harmony between inner and the outer world. The inner world is the replica of outer universe, and through yoga one can try to make a balance, a harmony between the inner universe and its outer representation in the world. And it also has its connections and origins from spiritual and practical dimensions in the different shastras, in different disciplines and different practices. When we look at the types of yoga, there are a number of yogas like Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raj Yoga, Hatha Yoga. The three powers of human instrument, body, heart and mind, have produced three major paths to the divine. And for example, the path of action in the world, this is achieved through body, and this is part of Karma Yoga. So Karma Yoga focuses upon body, and through body it leads the path of action in the world. Then Bhakti Yoga, that is through heart, and it leads to the path of love. And then third, Jnana Yoga, which is the path of mindfulness and the mind, and it is led through Jnana, through path of knowledge, through Jnana Yoga. Patanjali has given 8 types, 8 folds of these paths. They are called like 8 different limbs of yoga, and they are Yam, Niyam, Asana, Pranayam, Pratyahara, Dharan, Dhyan and Samadhi. Yam, which means ethical restraints, that includes ahimsa, non-violence, satya, truthfulness, and non-stealing, chori na karna, brahmacharya, celibacy, aparigrah, non-possessiveness, that one should not focus on the things of others. Then niyam. Niyam means personal observance, moral commitments, and it includes purity, santosh, which means self-contentment, tapas, austerity, swadhyay, self-study, and Ishwar Pranidhan, which means niskam karma and surrender to the God. Then third one, asana, which means postures, that talks about steady or sthir, comfortable or sukham postures. Then pranayam, this is in a very simple way known as breath control, but in a very deeper meaning it implies vital energy, life force, spirit and power. Pratyaha, which is withdrawal of senses, and where one controls one's senses, that leads to the cultivation of consciousness. Then dharana, which means concentration, and then dhyan, meditation. Samadhi, that is absorption or meditative trance, that leads to super consciousness and self-realization. It also brings the harmony of the self with the universe. And these 8 limbs of yoga, or 8 paths of yoga, have differently and in a larger extent also been adopted in the West. The question arises, why yoga in the West? When we look at the Western society, particularly after the First World War, and they had crisis of identity, disintegration of faith, disintegration of cultural and social values. Violence was spread everywhere, and the society was in turmoil. The basic values and practices, beliefs of the society were falling down, which W.B. Yeats has very well represented in his poem, The Second Coming, where he says, turning and turning, widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, center cannot hold. Everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned, blood dime tide is loosed. And everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate And in this way, we find that the Western condition of the society and country was disintegrating. The idea, they had spiritual disintegration, moral disintegration, and this leads to some kind of spiritual hollowness. This leads that people are in a way having fragmentation of their identity, and it was at this point of time that W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot began to focus on Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy, and one of those philosophical systems was yoga. So we find over here that how Indian philosophical traditions or yoga has been adopted and brought in the Western context by Yeats and Eliot. And the purpose was that how it can help people in the post-world wars. And it was meant for mental and emotional equilibrium. And the idea of yoga was that it can help the modern society to get rid of their disillusionment and disintegration. And it also reflects a quest for meaning and healing by the Western society. And we find that both Yeats and Eliot, they were influenced by Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and they studied yoga in Sanskrit through the scholars of Sanskrit. And in this way, it aims to bridge the ancient wisdom and modern thought in the Western traditions. When we look at W.B. Yeats and how yoga is found in his poetry, first of all, Yeats collaborated with Purohit Swami on Upanishads and yoga texts. He corrected some of the translations of yoga in English, and he was deeply influenced by the ideas and the philosophy of yoga. And this idea is found in his poems Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium, and where he focuses on the soul's journey and detachment from senses. He talks about a poetic representation of samadhi or spiritual transformation at the end of the poem Sailing to Byzantium and in Byzantium. What we find over here, that in these poems, Yeats is trying to say that he has become old, and this country is not for old people like him. He wants to withdraw his senses. He wants to control his senses, and he needs to follow what you call yam niyam, and the end of the poem, where he leaves for the Byzantium, and that is like his departure for not just what you call the physical departure to Byzantium, but it is also the travel of soul, the departure of soul for samadhi. And we find that in both poems, Sailing to Byzantium and Byzantium, Yeats represent that old age as detachment from the sensual world. I'll give an extract from the poem in the next slide, where he finds that the young people are like in each other's arms, they are sensual, they are busy in sensual pleasures, but an old person like him, he needs eternal wisdom, and he's yearning for eternal wisdom, not physical pleasures. He invokes samadhi, the yogic meditative trance, and where he compares the soul with the artifice of eternity. And in this way, in these poems, we find all the 8 folds of yoga, all the 8 limbs of yoga, all the 8 paths of yoga. The lines like the salmon falls the mackerel, crowd sees, fish, flesh are foul, comment all summer long, whatever is begotten, born and dies. So fish, flesh, foul. These are about the bodily pleasures, and this is what eats want to control. And in the later part in the poem, where he says, "Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and gather me into the artifice of eternity." This is a moment where he goes with the notion of samadhi, with the notion of higher consciousness, self-realization. I'll not go into detail about these poems, but it provides like how it embodies the idea of yoga in these poems. When we look at T.S. Eliot, he has adopted and followed the concept of yoga in his poems as well as in his plays, as well as in his literary essays. He studied Yoga Sutra with James Huntington Woods, and the idea, the philosophy of Yoga Sutra influenced his poems like The Wasteland, The Four Quatrains, where he adopts most of the concepts and ideas from yoga and Indian philosophy. And when we talk about the wasteland, and we find that the very presence of Tiresias is a kind of yogic drashta, a yogic witness who knows everything about from the past to present and the future. And then we have different parts and different sections, different stories and narratives in the poem which talks about the thoughts and ideas of yoga. For example, in the section The Fire Sermon, it talks about, it explores about the idea of detachment from material existence. And the last section, what the thunder said, is it echoes Upanishadic wisdoms, and it relates with what you call the idea of higher consciousness. And it is also aimed to provide some kind of relief and emotional support to the people there. And the concluding line of the poem, give, sympathize, control, data dayadhoyam damayat. It is about how yoga aims to control the body and mind. It talks about the idea of yoga and how it can be incorporated. In the poem The Wasteland, we do have the exact representation of bodily postures we may believe in. For example, in the section Fire Sermon, over here we find the depiction of yoga postures or asana in the poem. Undid me by nourishment, I raised my knees, supine on the floor of narrow canoe. My feet are at Moorgate and my heart under my feet. After the event he wept, he promised a new start. It depicts that how we have exact representation of the physical postures of yoga in the poem. Further, like when you have from the Fire Sermon section where St. Augustine came from Carthage, and it says, to Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out, O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. It indicates cleansing of the soul, purity of the soul, purity of one's thoughts and desires. And then there are many other examples which talks about yogic practices and yoga, different limbs of yoga in the poem. And when we look at his theory of poetry, where he says that poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. And this escape, this extinction of personality is, in a way, yogic detachment. It talks about that how that like an yogic poetry should be depersonalized. It shouldn't be about personal. It should be having like actions without self-involvement. His idea of mind is a catalyst, not an emotional actor, is in a way influenced by the idea of spiritual psychology and the idea of Patanjali's yogas. And when he talks about concentration over recollection, that is also a kind of yogic focus. And when we look at the role of yoga in Indian and Western cultures, though yoga originated in India and its influence became worldwide popular, and we find that yoga aims to bridge the cultural gaps. It helps to integrate Eastern spirituality into Western literature, Western science, Western society. Yoga has inspired deeper interest in Indian philosophy and in terms of universal path to truth. It also provides cultural synthesis through poetic imagination. And in the present times, it has become a heritage recognition by UNESCO. It will be celebrated and practiced internationally on 21st June. And this way we find that the Indian system of keeping the harmony between body, mind, and soul has influenced the world over. And it also remains important and continues to thrive in the Western culture in terms of its mindfulness, therapy, and lifestyles, because it will help with mental health concerns and it will help with how one can concentrate one's mind. To conclude, yoga helps the West to reconnect itself with the inner self. And in this regard, we find that Eliot and Yeats were pioneers in this journey, and they were influenced by Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Yoga remains a very important practice for those who have spiritual longings, and it remains a timeless practice. It bridges philosophy, art, and well-being. Thank you.